Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Marion, and I am the chair of Audubon Chapter of Minneapolis. I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone who tuned in tonight, especially those who are joining for the first time. We are really excited you're here and look forward to seeing you again. As we approach spring, our chapter looks forward to offering an array of bird outings around the metro area, and we will be updating our events calendar on our website and notifying all the people who have signed up for our emails. We welcome all people, regardless of age, background, or birding experience, and we provide binoculars to anyone who needs them, as well as accessibility notes on all of our birding locations. Last year, we piloted a bird outing for people with limited mobility, and we look forward to offering similar opportunities again this year. You may not consider yourself a birder, but if you've ever been curious to go outside and enjoy being around birds, we hope you take us up on our offer to go birding together and watch this space for some invitations to get outside this spring with us. Tonight, I am very pleased to introduce our presenter, Dan Herrera. Dan is a PhD student at the University of Maryland, studying how wildlife respond to urbanization. Much of his work focuses on how free-roaming cats, domestic cats, interact with wildlife, and he proposes data-driven approaches to managing outdoor cats that benefit both wildlife and cats alike. While Dan's current work is primarily in Washington, D.C., he actually worked for the University of Minnesota and is very eager to share his work with us tonight. If you have any questions during the presentation, I hope you can enter them in the Q&A function below the Zoom screen. We will field as many questions as time allows at the conclusion of the presentation. And so without further ado, I will turn the screen and microphone over to our presenter, Dan. Thanks, Dan.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for sharing your time with me this evening. Just want to confirm that you can see my screen here and it looks okay. I'm not hearing anybody say no, so I'm going to go ahead and move forward, assuming that y'all can see that. All right, well, my name is Dan. I have the very, very fortunate position of being trained as a wildlife ecologist, and I've had some incredible opportunities in my time in the field to work with just amazing species, really diverse taxa, working on some phenomenal behaviors, just a lot of really cool opportunities here. And I ran into this situation where my job kept getting cooler and cooler and cooler. Everywhere I went, I was working with something that I just topped my last activity. And I just kept thinking, what's next? How could it get any better than this? I was on cloud 9 until the winds changed and I ended up working on a feral cat project, which was about as far away from the work that I wanted to be doing as was physically possible. But I took the job working for a project called the DC Cat Count. And so I moved from Minneapolis out to DC. And the idea for the project was we were going to count all of the cats in Washington, DC. And the idea behind that, the impetus behind that was that knowing how many cats were in the area would help us, or would help the shelters there, make more informed population management decisions. Oftentimes, population management is based on the idea that you have to treat so much of a percent of the population every year for it to be effective. But if you don't know the overall population size, you have no idea what the subset of the population would be to reach a specific percent. So we were tasked with this project of counting all the cats in DC. And my particular role was to go around the city and I was to put out these motion activated cameras. And I was going to document the outdoor cat population, all the feral cats and the indoor outdoor cats and the cats that people just keep on their back porch. That was my job, to document those guys. And the idea was we're going to collect thousands and thousands and thousands of images over 3 years. And then we're going to sit down and look at all these images and just this very meticulous process of looking at each stripe on the cat, each coat color, each little spot from photo to photo and comparing, do we have 2 pictures of the same cat here? Is this a separate cat? And we were going to estimate the population size. And so I'm sitting there thinking, man, I was just working with all this really cool stuff. And now I'm doing this and I'm going to be poring over cat photos for the next 3 years of my life. And I'm trying to talk myself up about it. And I'm thinking, okay, we're moving to DC. DC is kind of a cool city. Maybe we'll have like a CIA style headquarters, and we'll have screens all around us. But instead of like looking at whatever they're looking at in this photo, we'll be looking at these pictures of cats and all this wildlife data. Maybe this can be really cool. I'm hyping myself up about it. And I'm trying to hype up my family as I'm explaining why I'm moving across the country for this. And they just look at me with this blank face. And the question they keep asking, and maybe the question that you were asking when I first brought this project up, is why? Why does this matter? Why would we need to devote resources to counting all the cats? Why do we need to have cat population management in the first place? And to be honest, I wasn't really all that sure why we needed that. And so before I made the move, I was sure to pick up a couple books, and I tried really to do a spectrum here of really anti-outdoor cat and really pro-outdoor cat. I wanted to hear everybody's perspective so I could come in with as non-biased of a view as possible. And the books were great, but they only got me so far. And so then I started diving into the scientific literature. And let me tell you, there's a ton of research out there on free roaming cats, and probably one of the most prolific areas of that research is on the extent to which cats kill wildlife. So oftentimes we hear about how many birds cats kill. Cats kill all these birds. And that's true. In the US, annually, it's estimated they kill about 2.4 billion birds. But what might shock you is that they actually kill 6 times more mammals than they do birds. And so while everybody's up in arms about the birds, and rightly so, cats are killing off way more mammals, but they don't just do birds and mammals. Cats kill amphibians, they kill reptiles. I'm showing here a video that we got on one of our cameras of a cat that killed a snake. Just for the fun of doing it, you can see it leaves it there. It's not even going to eat it. It was just something to occupy its time with, and then it's going to walk away. Now, I don't know what kind of snake this is. It's not a very high resolution photo. Maybe this is a very common snake, and from a biodiversity standpoint, maybe this isn't a huge loss. But the point is here that when a cat goes outside, it has a high capacity to predate wildlife, and it doesn't even necessarily need to survive. It just does this for enjoyment. And so cats are a cause for a lot of wildlife decline in the country. Now, maybe you're thinking there, you're sitting there thinking, what's the big deal? Like, wildlife populations are declining for other reasons. Let's not blame this all on cats. And you are right. Well, because this is an Audubon talk, we're going to specifically talk about birds now. You're right. We have seen declining bird populations, at least since the 1970s. So these graphs here are from a study that looked at some of those bird populations, looking at overall trends in the country. And normally, when an individual will reproduce before it dies, and generally it will produce at least one offspring to replace itself in the population, if not more. But what we're seeing in the US and Canada is that over a long period of time here, we're actually seeing more birds die than they are being born. And so we're losing many birds to that. And it's across all habitat types except for wetlands, of course, because there has been great movement to restore wetlands in the past 30 or 40 years. And so wetlands are actually increasing, so we're seeing more birds there. But within these ecosystems, we see that the species loss is not limited to just a couple kind of birds. The decline is actually widespread taxonomically. And if you're like me, you're sitting there thinking, what could be causing all this bird decline? Surely it's not cats. And then the answer comes to you: buildings and windmills, right? How many times have we been told that these are the causes of bird declines? We're all putting to it, right? And that's going to save all the birds. We're going to reverse this. Great. We can all go to bed easy at night. We've saved the bird situation. Well, it's not quite as easy as that. And actually, a group of researchers looked into why these bird declines were happening, the anthropogenic causes for it. And they looked at all these, they did a big literature review of all these papers that described these population trends and what was causing them. And these circles on the screen right now are actually proportional to the causes that they found in the literature. About 75% of the bird loss was contributed in the literature to domestic cats. Only about 18% was to running into buildings and wind turbines. Less than 1%, less than 0.5% of bird loss is attributed to wind turbines. So overwhelming majority of bird loss, reported mortality, is coming from cats. Now we have to consider that this doesn't account for habitat loss, which is also a massive major threat, but it's really too nuanced for the authors to have tackled here, and so they did not include that. But still, the comparison of mortality from birds compared to that of buildings and wind turbines is really striking. And maybe now that we've seen that information, you're thinking, okay, well, Dan, we know that cats are killing animals. Like that was never a mystery. That's their job. Maybe you, like many, many others, put your cat outside so it can control the rat population, right? Nobody wants rats. That's understandable. And if a cat kills a native animal every once in a while, that's negligible collateral damage. We can just move past that. Like they're doing their job just by getting the rats. If that's you, I have some bad news. And that is that actually most research finds that cats don't actually suppress the rat population. There was one particularly insightful study that fitted cats and rats with radio collars and monitored their behavior. They fitted rats with radio collars and monitored their behavior before and after cats were introduced to the system. And instead of being eaten by the cats, the rats just changed their behavior. And they did it in a way that made them be seen less by humans. They weren't eaten, they didn't die, they didn't run away. They were just a little bit more secretive. And so the conclusions that the authors drew from that is that when you put cats out for rats, it might seem like the cats reduce the rat population since you don't see rats as often. But in actuality, they're just actually being forced to be a little bit better at hiding, a little bit more sneaky. And you have just as many rats as you did before, potentially more rats than you did before if you're putting cat food outside, because that is an attractant to rats. So maybe you've heard some people say, or maybe you think yourself, my cat doesn't hunt. I hate to break it to you, you're probably wrong. It's a strong instinctual drive for cats to hunt. Most cats hunt. But maybe let's just suppose you're right. Maybe your cat doesn't hunt. There are still sublethal effects of having cats outside. And what I mean by that is a cat doesn't necessarily need to directly kill an animal to lead to some negative outcome, including death. A really interesting 2013 study observed blackbird nests when the scientists put a taxidermed cat next to the tree. So they set up shop with their binoculars, looking at the nest. They see mom, they see chicks, and then they pull out this stuffed cat and put it down. And mom suddenly has a behavioral reaction. And actually what happens, she perceives the cat there as a threat. It's a potential predator. And she switches from she switches from feeding her chicks to defending the nest. And as a result, she really reduces the amount on average of food fed to the chicks. And this behavior continues long after the cat was removed from the system. There was also no evidence that that food was ever made up for. It's not like she fed them extra the following day. Those chicks just lost out on some nutrients, which might have negative impacts on how they grow. You might be thinking, that's not too bad. I could skip a meal and I'd be okay. And maybe you're right, but responses do vary by species. Whereas blackbirds just give their chicks less food, there are some birds that just give up altogether. So researchers watching this colony of Australian fairy terns documented parental behavior after just one cat showed up on a beach, and rather than risk dying themselves, the parents abandoned the nest. So that's right. One cat destroyed 111 breeding nests without laying a paw. Just his presence alone caused such a strong behavioral response from the parents that they abandoned the chicks altogether. So even when a cat is not actively hunting, it can still have lethal effects on the wildlife population. Another way that cats can hurt wildlife without even hunting them is just through the transmission of diseases. So cats with access to the outdoors carry an alarming amount of parasites, and cats can transmit these to wildlife. So 72% of cats in a trap neuter return program in the US carried fleas when they were inspected. See 19% with ticks, 35% in a study in England carried tapeworm, 53% carried roundworm. So those are pretty high numbers. And especially outdoor cats don't often have consistent access to veterinary care. And so these problems often don't go treated. Another massive parasite and really interesting one is called Toxoplasmosis gondii. Toxoplasmosis for short, or if we're going even shorter, we can call it toxo. And toxoplasmosis is really interesting. It exclusively reproduces in cats, but it's passed to other animals through cat feces. So when an animal comes in contact with infected feces, that other animal becomes infected and the parasite actually changes their behavior. It causes delayed responses and gives less of a fear response. So a mouse that might be infected by toxoplasmosis from a cat is going to be less scared of predators. And this actually helps complete the parasite's life cycle. Since the mouse is less scared of predators, it's not going to run away when it sees the cat. The cat can get it a little bit easier, consume the mouse, and then the parasite is back in the cat and it can reproduce again. And so it's completing the parasitic life cycle there. Really, really, really fascinating biological phenomenon. But what are the ecosystem implications? Well, for larger species, well, really for any species, since it has a less of a fear response after being infected, it might actually cause them to change their behavior and start walking into roads a little bit more, be less fearful of cars in the roadway. One study found that 31% of roadkill tested positive for toxoplasmosis, which was well above the background rate. And while correlation is not the same as causation, it's possible that the toxo infection here caused these individuals to be less fearful of vehicles, and they walked into the roadway and unfortunately paid the price for it. So this can be a bummer. Obviously, if it's a smaller animal, that's not going to inflict damage to your vehicle or to you. But for larger species like deer that can cause a significant amount of damage to your vehicle and potentially put your own health at risk, this could be a pretty serious issue that is otherwise avoidable, right? If we kept the cats away from the outdoors, if we kept them indoors, we would cut off the spread of toxoplasmosis and this wouldn't be an issue. But because the cats are out there, there is the possibility of this circulating in the system. And so we are potentially amplifying the amount of roadkill that is happening. It's also fascinating because toxoplasmosis can impact aquatic and semi-aquatic species. So if an infected cat poop ends up in a stream, it's going to be washed down the stream into a body of water, and it can infect animals that have never even seen a cat. So this is happening with seals. Seals are becoming infected because the waterways that lead into where they're at are carrying toxoplasmosis, and it's quite possible that they don't even know what a cat is, right? They've never seen one, but they are still being infected by it nonetheless. Beyond wildlife, it can infect humans. A very, very common route of transmission is for actually livestock to become infected, and then humans eat that livestock, and especially if we're undercooking meat, or maybe you're cooking meat just fine, but you don't wash your hands and then you touch your mouth or something, it's possible to transmit the disease that way. The CDC actually estimates that 40 million Americans, that's a little bit more than 1 in 10, carry toxoplasmosis. And thankfully, most human cases are asymptomatic, but that is not always the case. And when they are symptomatic, it can be pretty serious. There's a really interesting study that tested people who got in car accidents for toxoplasmosis, as well as their neighbors. And the study found that people who tested positive for toxo had 2.65 vehicle accidents for every one accident that a toxoplasmosis negative person did. It's not clear if this is a product of delayed reaction, right? Toxoplasmosis is causing drivers to be have delayed reactions, and so maybe they aren't reacting fast enough, and that's when they're getting hit, or they're hitting somebody else because they're not putting on the brakes. So that could be one way this is explained. The other way is that the toxoplasmosis is increasing their boldness behavior, and so maybe they are running pretty stale yellow lights that they wouldn't have otherwise done that, but because they have this increased boldness, they're making these decisions, and maybe that is ultimately what's leading to riskier driving and the resulting higher accident. I do want to give a trigger warning here. This next slide contains information about miscarriages in humans. So if this is a sensitive topic to you, please feel empowered to mute your computer, walk away. Feel free to come back and join us again in about a minute, and we'll be off the topic. I'll give you a second to do that if that applies to you. Okay. I think one of the most detrimental repercussions of toxoplasmosis for humans is that the amplified risk of miscarriage. So a retrospective study tested expecting mothers and found that mothers that test positive for toxoplasmosis experience a spontaneous abortion at 10 times higher rate than women who tested negative. So similar to the traffic study, this study is correlation, it's not causation. They didn't infect anybody with toxoplasmosis and see what happened. So there are undoubtedly other factors at risk here, or other factors at play here that contribute to this. But the numbers speak for themselves. And this is a very high difference between the two groups of mothers. And it really is there's just not words. And this is an entirely avoidable situation. So let's recap where we've come to at this point. So we've established that cats pose a serious risk to the environment. We've also dabbled in their effects on public health. But what about the other way around? Do the outdoors pose a risk to cats? Turns out there's a decent amount of research on this question as well. And the answer is emphatically yes, the outdoors do pose a risk to cats. There are several estimates that compare the average lifespan of an outdoor cat to an indoor cat. And so if you Google this, you can probably find some other answers, or some other figures that differ from this. But broadly, you'll just see a large discrepancy between the lifespan of an indoor cat and the lifespan of an outdoor cat. So here, the figures from this journal are saying that the average lifespan of a feral cat is 2 years, whereas it's 10 years for an indoor cat. That is a huge discrepancy. And the point here is that indoor cats live much longer lives. So you'll remember this slide, we've already talked about it, but I wanted to bring it back as a reminder. Not only do indoor cats live much longer lives, but they presumably live much healthier lives and more comfortable. I wouldn't know. I've never had worms or fleas, but I can imagine, and I'm sure you can as well, that it makes for a pretty rough life and not exactly a humane situation. And so cats that are kept inside and that are getting regular veterinary care are being inspected for these things, are being treated for these things if they come up positive. And it's not really going to be something that's going to plague them for their whole life. But cats that are outside not having access to that veterinary care, unfortunately, might be living a pretty uncomfortable life with these unwelcome friends that they've made. What else can cats be exposed to? Rabies. The data on the screen right here are specifically for Minnesota in, I believe, 2003 to 2020. So thankfully, cats in your area rarely test positive for rabies, which is fantastic because rabies is fatal in animals. But in the rare cases that a cat is rabid, it presents a particular threat for public health. Reason being, when a raccoon is rabid or a skunk is rabid or some other animal is rabid, I don't know about you, but I never open up my door at night and invite a raccoon inside to see what happens. And I surely don't do that with skunks. But if I had an indoor-outdoor cat and I opened up my door at night and I didn't know that it had been infected with rabies, I would be letting that then into my home. And so there's just a socio-cultural association that we have with cats where we are so much closer with them as a society than we are with the other animals that tend to carry rabies. Similarly, a little kid who doesn't know what rabies really looks like, doesn't know to look for foaming at the mouth or anything like that, regardless of whether a raccoon is foaming at the mouth, they're not going to run up and try to pet a raccoon. But if a child sees a cat in their neighborhood and it looks really cute, maybe per se, there's the risk that they're going to go up and try to pet it and hug it and hold it. And again, if that cat has rabies, we are just putting together a very dangerous situation for the humans involved who don't know how to look for those signs. And so in this case, our tie with cats actually makes them a larger rabies risk to humans, even though they tend to carry rabies at lower rates. And maybe you're sitting there thinking, that's why we vaccinate cats against rabies. And you're right, that is exactly why we vaccinate them against rabies. But rabies vaccinations actually often expire before the lifetime is over. So maybe you bring your pet cat to the vet and they're getting vaccinated every year, and that's all good and well. But if a feral cat is only going to the vet once, it's possible that they are going to outlive the lifespan of that vaccination. And so it's not really going to be effective. Also, think back to COVID when we were really trying to get those vaccines out, and we talked a lot about herd immunity. And one thing that we learned is that vaccination rates have to supersede, they have to be greater than transmission rates. And if vaccination rates are lower than transmission rates, the vaccine isn't going to contain the illness. And what we know is that rabies actually tends to travel faster than most clinics are able to vaccinate cats. And so do rabies vaccines help? Yeah, to some extent they do help. I'm not advocating we don't do this. I strongly believe that we should continue to vaccinate cats, but we can't rely on this as a silver bullet. So we've talked about disease, uh, but what else causes cats to die earlier when they're outdoors as opposed to when they're indoors? And one big answer to that is predation. Right, we're going to flip the coin. Cats predate wildlife, but some wildlife predates cats. Various studies have examined coyote feces for remains of domestic cats, and they've found that anywhere between 1 and 20% of coyote scats include domestic cat remains. You might be sitting there thinking, have I ever seen a coyote in my neighborhood? And it's possible that the answer is no. Coyotes are very flexible in their behavior. Oftentimes, especially in urban areas, they tend to be nocturnal. So it's possible that there are coyotes roaming around your neighborhood while you're sleeping and you just don't see them. But even if that's not the case, I want to show you a map of the coyote range in the US. There used to be a southwestern species. We extirpated wolves from the US largely, and we opened up the rest of the country to be their habitat. And so coyotes have been colonizing across the US and much of Canada and much of Central America. And today, actually, coyotes are the most widespread native mammal in the US. They are literally everywhere in the US. And so when you consider the two facts that 1 in 5 coyotes are eating cats, and coyotes are spread across the country, that's a lot of cats meeting a cruel but entirely avoidable fate just because they're outside in the same space as a coyote. Maybe even more distressing than cats getting eaten by animals is cats getting hit by cars. Nobody likes to see that. We had a roadkill cat on our street over Christmas, and it really put a damper on the holidays. It's not an enjoyable sight. Few municipalities collect data regarding roadkill. They often just scoop it up and that's the end of it. But one county in California, Yolo County, actually did. And they found that over the 3 years that they collected these data, there was an average of roughly 2 roadkill cats per mile of roadway. So take a minute to think about, what does your commute to work look like? How many miles are you commuting every day? And then do a little bit of mental math. So multiply your commute by 2. That's a lot of dead cats. And that's a really sad thought, right? Because once again, this is entirely avoidable. We don't have to have cats out here meeting this fate. We could, if we kept them inside and we didn't allow them out on the streets, it wouldn't be coming to this end, but this is the situation we're at. Another big risk for cats is the ingestion of poison. I don't know about you, I don't have much poison laying around my house that my pets can eat. But when there's a poison outside in the environment and a cat's out there and it's not being supervised, it's entirely possible that it will eat it. Maybe it eats it directly. It seems like an odd thing, probably wouldn't do that. But more likely is that cats are eating animals that have ingested that poison. So when you consider that 10% of rats in any urban area are walking around with some amount of poison in them, it's just a sublethal amount, it wasn't enough to kill them. They're kind of like little cyanide pillows with legs. They're running around full of poison, cats are coming and eating them, and then the cats themselves are ingesting that poison. Doing this a couple times probably isn't enough, right? If it wasn't even enough poison to kill the rat, it's not going to kill the cat. But over a lifetime, this builds up. Right? We call this bioaccumulation, and we slowly have more and more and more toxicity inside the cat until eventually this can have detrimental effects on the cats. And we see from several different studies from around the world that this is seen. We saw about 9% of cats in France that had been poisoned had consumed rodenticide, 26% of cats that had consumed pesticides in Brazil. So this does happen, although it's not something we necessarily think about. It is a risk out there. And again, because we don't leave pesticides or rodenticides necessarily out in our living room, indoor cats are not exposed to these risks, but outdoor cats are. So we've poured through the literature, right? I took you on this journey that I went on as I really tried to understand, what are the risks to cats? What are the risks to wildlife? And now we know that cats inflict harm on the environment, and vice versa, the environment inflicts harm on cats. And so our takeaway here is it's in the best interest of all species if cats are kept indoors. Period. That's it. Your cat is not the exception. Your neighbor's cat isn't the exception. Your grandma's cat isn't the exception. Cats should be kept indoors. Whether it hunts or not, whether it stays in your neighborhood, whatever your justification is, your cat is a risk when it goes outside. It damages the environment, and the environment poses serious risks to the welfare and the health of your cat. So with that in mind, with all this research, all the data behind this, we have to ask ourselves, why are there still so many free roaming cats? Why do we still have so many cats out there on the street? Right? We've established all these negative outcomes and impacts. We have so much research on the topic. Surely we should have stopped this by now. And the answer, it's the same as it is with most animal issues. The answer is largely because this is actually more of a people issue than it is an animal issue. The cats, we can't fault them, right? They're just living their own life, and they were maybe born in the alley, so that's all they know, or they were abandoned by somebody, right? They're just trying to survive. Nobody can fault an animal for doing that. But it's the people that are putting them into that situation that we need to talk to and maybe reconsider what we're doing, because our actions do have ramifications that maybe we don't see, but they are there, they are real. And so this is a people issue more than an animal issue. So with that in mind, let's take a little look at the literature about the people that interact with outdoor cats. So despite all the research that cats should not be outdoors, people tend to have conflicting opinions about how to manage free roaming cats. So a team of researchers surveyed people to get their thoughts on free roaming cats. And what they found is that actually a little less than half of cat owners believe cats should stay on their own property, despite nearly 70% of non-cat owners wanting this to be the case. So if you don't own a cat, you don't want somebody else's cat on your land, right? That makes sense. It's pretty intuitive. And most non-cat owners feel that way. But most cat just under half of cat owners feel otherwise and believe that it's okay for their cat to wander on somebody else's property because of whatever justification they give to themselves. But we need to remember here that just because you are okay with your cat leaving your property doesn't mean that your neighbors are okay with your cat coming onto their property. Even fewer cat owners believe that there's a need for cat legislation at all, with non-cat owners tending to agree, despite clear evidence showing the negative outcomes. So you might be wondering how someone could know all the risks and still believe that cats shouldn't be indoors. And the answer here is by and large that they don't care. Only 21% of cat owners believe that cats killing wildlife in urban areas is a problem. And less than half of cat owners think that cats in nature reserves present any problems to the ecosystems being preserved. I want to say that again to make sure we're all on the same page. Only 45% of cat owners think it's problematic to allow their non-native obligate carnivorous pet to roam free within the few patches of habitat specifically set aside to protect wildlife. The few areas that we put aside for wildlife to escape the pressures presented by human society. But how can that be? Well, it's because cat owners tend to be motivated more by their cat than they are by wildlife. And as evidence of this, cat owners who do choose to keep their cats indoors were asked why they do that. 45% said it was to protect their cat, compared to only 14% saying it's to protect wildlife. And even though cat owners tend to prioritize their cats, studies have found that cat owners routinely underestimate the risks presented to their cats when they go outside. And so you can see where this lands us. Basically, we have two schools of thought, and they come to very opposite conclusions. One school says that policy should be written to protect the freedoms, so to speak, of cats. And the other says policy should be written to protect the safety of wildlife and cats alike. And with opposing views, progress is rarely made. But there has to be a way forward, right? Like, we can't just sit in this balance for perpetuity. Like, this just seems like an issue that we can come together on and maybe find some common ground. And the good news is, I'm here to tell you some of that today because that's what a lot of my research is on. So I talked earlier about how I started this whole journey because I was on the DC Cat Con. Well, we finished this project. We had over 1,500 camera sites. We took over 6 million photographs of all these different species. We had 33 species, over 22,000 survey days. So an enormous, enormous effort. And all that effort paid off, right? We got a ton of data from it, and it allowed us to run some interesting analyses to see, to come up with a couple of very interesting conclusions about cats and wildlife in the city. And so the first conclusion from my own work is that cats and potential rabies vectors have a very high probability of coming in contact in DC. So this top row of maps here, these are all the shape of Washington, DC, and we just have 3 different spatial scales. But this top row of maps is the probability of a raccoon occurring in that part of the city, with warmer colors meaning a higher probability and cooler colors meaning a lower probability. So just to reiterate, these yellow colors, there's a high probability of a raccoon being there, but where it gets kind of blue-green, there's less of a probability of a raccoon being there. And raccoons are the most common rabies vector in our area. The bottom maps show the probability of both a raccoon and a cat existing in the same space. Similarly, hotter colors mean a higher probability, cooler colors mean lower probability. And you can see that actually there's substantial overlap between cats and raccoons. The average location in the city has about a 60% probability that a cat and raccoon share that location, share that space. So high spatial overlap, but do they overlap in time, right? We need some physical contact for the rabies to be transferred from one animal to another. So maybe if raccoons are active at night and then they go to sleep and cats come and they hang out in the same space, but it's during the day and they never come in contact, then we don't really have that issue. So maybe that could be our saving grace. So we looked into that and we looked at the activity patterns. And so that's what this clock is here on the right. This smaller circle is cat activity. And then this kind of light blue polygon is raccoon activity. Where you see peaks, it means the highest amount of activity. So here, this peak indicates that raccoons are most active at about 4 o'clock in the morning. You might be looking at the cat activity plot and thinking there's not really much of a peak there, and you would be absolutely right. And that's because we found something very interesting, and it's that as a species, cats don't have a set activity pattern. They're active actually 24 hours a day. It's not like one cat is staying up for 24 hours, but maybe this cat stays up for 4 hours and it overlaps with this cat that stays up for 4 hours, and another cat overlaps with that. And so one by one, they're all taking their turn on the watch. And as a result, cats are active throughout the day. And so what we can draw from this as a conclusion is that wherever a cat overlaps in space with an animal, it's probably going to overlap in time since cats as a species are consistently active. So we did that with rabies vector species. We also did it with prey species, excuse me. So same analysis, same way to read these maps. And in this case, we looked at the eastern chipmunk. And you can see the probability of overlapping spatially is actually much lower, and that's fantastic news, right? So there's going to be reduced predation pressure on this species because it's not encountering cats as often. But the 2 species still overlap despite chipmunks being active during the day. So even though there's a lower probability of occurring in the same space, where they do occur in the same space, again, they probably overlap in their activity here. So a couple general conclusions, though, that came out of this work that were really cool is that wildlife species, not surprisingly, tended to have positive associations with canopy cover. So that's the trees in the area. So the more trees there were, the higher the probability we were going to see wildlife there. And then a positive association with open water, so rivers and streams and ponds, because that, of course, is these animals' primary means of hydration. And cats, on the flip side, have a negative relationship with canopy cover and a negative relationship with water. And that, broadly speaking, is great news because it's kind of partitioning cats and wildlife. What that's saying is because areas with high canopy cover tend to be forested and lower canopy cover tend to be more urban, maybe we can find a forest-urban split where we allow cats in the urban areas, since we don't see high social being there, but we don't allow them in the forested areas. So maybe this is like really great room for compromise. We can say, yeah, go ahead, put your cats in the neighborhood, but keep them out of the woods. And boom, simple, done, right? Like we come up with this amazing collaborative process and everybody's happy. We get to keep some cats on the street for those who want them there, but they're not going to be a problem for those who don't want them there. Very simple until we see something like this, right? So what do we call this? The cat is admittedly on a road or an alley, but the forest starts right behind the alley. Are they close enough to have a negative impact? Remember all those sublethal effects where the bird in the tree right there just needs to see the cat and to cause issues. So maybe is this considered kind of like too close to the woods? Who knows, right? Like we had to start another study to look at this question to try to understand how close to the forest is too close. And to do that, we looked specifically at predation data. So out of all those photos we took of cats, a couple of them, um, but not the majority, obviously, were of cats carrying prey species. And so we looked through these photos and we identified where the photo was taken, when it was taken, and what species the cat was carrying. And we assumed that to be hunting. Is it possible that the cat picked up an animal that it found dead? Absolutely, it's possible that it did that. But we, for the sake of this study, assumed that anytime a cat was carrying prey, that was a hunting event. So then we analyzed the factors contributing to cats preying on native species in particular. Like I said earlier, if a cat kills a rat, not a big deal, right? Like ecologically speaking, from a biodiversity standpoint, rats are also invasive. They also have negative implications for public health, for the ecosystem. And so we don't so much mind when a cat kills a rat, but we're looking to see when cats kill native species because that's what we're a little bit more concerned about. And what we ended up finding was that, probably not a surprise, as a cat approaches the forest edge, the probability of its prey being a native species increases dramatically. And this starts allowing us to think numerically, putting hard numbers on this. What is a safe distance for cats to be from a forest based on some acceptable predation rates? So maybe we're okay with a 50-50 chance that it's a native species. So that would be about here. So we follow that over and we drop it down. And maybe that's about 100 meters from the forest edge. Maybe we're going to be really, really, really careful and we say, no, we don't want any chance that a cat is going to kill native wildlife. So we come to the 0% probability threshold and take it over. And that puts us at about 750-ish meters from the forest edge. So we got to pick a number, right? We could have any number, we could pick any of those probability thresholds and draw buffers from forests based on that. And that would be potentially good policy. You know, that would help us move in some direction. But it's not necessarily data driven. It is data driven in that it's derived from a model, but it's not data driven since we at the end are still just arbitrarily picking a threshold. So just here on the screen, the far left shows what it would look like to exclude cats, the exclusion zone here being that red pink color. If we excluded them with a less than 1 or a close to 0% probability threshold. And on the far right shows that 50-50 scenario that we talked about. And so we have to pick one of those thresholds, and to help us pick which one this is rather than arbitrarily selecting it, we looked at the same model but with rats. And when we looked at the probability of a cat preying on a rat, we actually found the opposite trend. So that is, when a cat leaves the forest, the probability of preying on rats becomes greater. So that's an inverse relationship to what it was with cats. And considered together, this is actually a really cool finding and a really clean way to do this. We can look at when the rat line passes the native species line, and where they meet, we know that the probability of a cat preying on a rat actually surpasses the probability of a cat preying on a native species. And so in DC, that's at approximately 250 meters from the forest edge. And so that is about here. So even though that's still about a 25% probability that the cat will prey on a native species, the probability that it's going to kill a rat is actually higher at that point. So we take that number, that 250 meters, we slap another 100 meters on to account for the cat's wandering, because that's the average home range of a cat, about 100 meters. And so if we had put the cat here at the actual probability threshold, it could still walk into the woods and prove problematic. But if we put the cat here at the edge of the home range buffer, the end of its home range would come up against the probability buffer, and we would be able to achieve the results we're looking for here. So in DC, this is what that would look like. The probability buffer here, again, is in that pinkish red color, and that is where we would exclude cats from. Which means we're talking here about a compromise, right? We would allow cats, or the policy would be written in such a way that we don't take action against outdoor cats in the parts of the city that are more built up, more urbanized, kind of in the center of the city there. The idea here is that that would protect wildlife. Does it remove, is it perfect? No. Does it remove the risk of the outdoors to cats? No, it does not. Because cats can still get hit by cars in these areas, still ingest poison. Species that have larger home ranges, like coyotes, are going to leave the woods occasionally, and they could still prey on a cat in the center there. So this compromise, admittedly, is aimed much more so at protecting wildlife than it is protecting cats. But it is a way to try to allow kind of both sides of the argument, those against free roaming cats and those for free roaming cats, to both have a say and to both feel like they are getting something here, right? We're not removing all the cats from the landscape. So you might be looking at this and thinking that this is a nice compromise. It's a nice, potentially palatable response. It's not all or nothing, and it's a good academic exercise. But I don't live in DC, right? You all live in the great state of Minnesota, many of you in Minneapolis. And so this might, looking at a DC map, how is that going to help you? So I then took the liberty to put this onto y'all's area. So it's Minneapolis and St. Paul. So the model is built off of distance to forest edge. So I pulled in all the canopy cover for your area. And let me tell you, you have a lot of trees. So this is great. There's a lot of trees in this city, but not every tree is a forest, right? So we can't say that this is all forest. A lot of these are probably just trees in people's yards that are standing alone. And that's clearly not a forest. We've got to isolate this out to forests. And for that, we use the US Forest Service definition of at least 1 acre in area, and then at least 120 feet wide. And so I thinned out all those trees to be just the forest patches, and then applied the same buffer distance, that 350 meters that we saw in DC. I applied it to Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so when you add the buffer to the patches, this is what it looks like. And I want to clarify here, this is an approximation. So if you are grabbing your phone and taking a picture of this or a screenshot or whatever, that's fine as an academic exercise, but a more detailed analysis would actually be needed to come up with something a little bit more set in stone. This is really just to show you what something might look like, to stress the point that there are options out there that are not all or nothing, right? We don't need to write policies to say no cats allowed across the city, but we could potentially strike some compromise here where their cats are allowed in some places and not others. And this map provides an idea of what that could potentially look like. But again, would need to be studied in a little bit more detail before maybe policy is based off of this. So this is really just food for thought. So I'll leave you with these conclusions. Cats pose a risk to wildlife, and wildlife poses a risk to cats. We can find a way when we work together and we're willing to listen to each other, to truly listen and hear each other. We can find a way to work together to fix this. And when we do that, it's going to protect cats, it's going to protect wildlife, it's going to improve the welfare of cats, the safety of cats, it's going to have positive benefits on public health. Folks, this is a no-brainer. We can work together on this if we are willing to listen to one another and if we're willing to compromise. So with that, I do want to thank you. I will leave this up here for a little bit. Feel free to take a picture, write my email down. I would love to field any questions you have now, but if you are thinking of something later and you have a question, please feel free to shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from you and I would be happy to respond. And I just want to let you know as well, all the references, all the studies I referenced in this presentation, if you would like to read them, again, shoot me an email. I would be happy to pass this along to you so that you all can read that science on your own. But thank you again for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dan. That was such an informative talk. And I just wanted to add a personal anecdote. My dad was a forest ranger when I was a kid, and we lived in the guard residence of the Forest Preserve in Illinois, and we're surrounded by nature. And we had a big orange fluffy cat named Oscar, and he was an indoor-outdoor cat and would catch birds and baby bunnies. And now I look back in horror, and even that was kind of what I was thinking of during your talk, and sort of thinking like, how did our family, like we were in nature, like we loved, like my dad's job was being a steward of the environment. And then on the other hand, we have this outdoor cat bringing us dead birds. And I was trying to think of like at what point I got to that tipping point of like a mindset change, or just maybe enough education. And I think for me, it was maybe realizing like, okay, I'm not the only one with a cat killing birds. So like, if everyone had one cat that killed a bird once a month, like
Right, right.
um, what would that impact be? Versus just thinking about like, well, like he's not doing that many. So it was
Yeah,
that interesting, like looking back on my personal experience as like a former cat owner and current bird lover, and just sort of thinking through um, that journey to maybe having a different outlook. So with that, I can open the floor to questions. I have a couple of questions, but the first one was just a data clarification about the Yolo County statistics. And it was asking if the 2.3 cats hit per mile, or cats hit every 2 miles per day, what was the time frame of that study? And if you could just clarify what
yeah.
that ratio was that you were citing.
Thank you for asking that question. I think it was bizarre the way that they reported it, and it took me reading the study a couple times to get that answer myself. So that 2.03 cats per mile roadway was over the 3 years of their study. So it's not 2 cats a day per mile roadway. It's they were patrolling the roads every week or whatever their frequency was for 3 years. They counted the number of cats that they ultimately found, and that over that 3 year period, and divided that number by the linear miles of the road network. So it's not, they didn't really account for anything temporal in that analysis, which admittedly makes it a little confusing on first glance to understand.
Okay. And then also maybe just to clarify on the outset, it sounds like domestic cats are being grouped into one demographic of domestic cats, but we have cats that have a human caretaker that who allow them to go outside. And then there's also a feral cat population, and both of them are interacting maybe in slightly different ways, but all impacting. And so I don't know if you wanted to like, if there's any distinction that needs to be made between different types of outdoor cats.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. And I should have mentioned that from the get-go. I use the term free roaming cat because it's the most broadly applicable. It's just any cat that goes outside, and it covers any domestic cat in that grouping. Domestic cat itself is a species, and then there are domestic cats that are born in houses and they're housebroken, whatever, to the extent that you can housebreak a cat, and we call those indoor cats. There are also cats that are born outdoors. We tend to call them feral. Feral really just means that they're not socialized. You can be an outdoor cat without being feral. A friendly outdoor cat is technically not feral because it has been socialized. It would just be an outdoor cat at that point. Some people take issue with feral because they feed the cats. And so if it's fed, is it really, on its own? Indoor outdoor cats, are a whole different breed. They're not. That was confusing wording. That's not a whole different breed. They're a whole different matter where people will let their cat come and go as they please. And so I try to use free roaming cat because that term applies to all of them. And oftentimes when you say outdoor cat or feral cat, somebody will say, oh, well, my cat's indoor outdoor. So it doesn't fit into that, right? Like you're talking about this kind of cat. And really these statistics, much of our outdoor cat studies in conservation science, we don't necessarily know what the cat situation is, right? We're watching the cat as it interacts with wildlife, as it interacts with the environment. We don't have the capacity to follow it all day. It's entirely possible that the second we stop watching, it goes inside somebody's living room and it's an indoor outdoor cat. It's equally possible that it has never stepped paw inside of a house and it's been feral its whole life. We don't know that. And so our statistics oftentimes can't differentiate that. And so we just say broadly a cat outdoors, an outdoor cat, a free roaming cat has these impacts.
Great. So we have a couple questions. I think they're really interesting, that bring some equity concerns into the idea of like an exclusionary zone, and people asking like if maybe the denser, um, less forested areas are cat inclusionary zones. Would they then have a higher concentration of like the health risks to cats? And so are there equity concerns of that relate to a compromise policy with versus the more I guess controversial
Yeah.
policy like an outright like at large ban?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. To be honest, I've never considered that, and that's going to be something I consider going forward. So thank you for raising that. I think that you're absolutely right. It could potentially have a outspoken or disproportionate impact on those areas. There is still, of course, the potential, since a lot of times toxoplasmosis is transmitted through meat consumption. Um, people even living in the exclusionary zones are, unless they're vegetarian or vegan, are still going to be eating meat, and so they still run that risk of getting those diseases. Maybe they have a lower risk of rabies from cats in those areas, but they would probably also have a higher risk of rabies than from raccoons or possums or skunks. So I definitely think there would be trade-offs, and I think it's also worth considering as the policy stands today, and I say this with the caveat that I am not entirely familiar with Minneapolis nor St. Paul's free roaming cat policy, but I'm assuming that the current policy, well, that there isn't a current policy. As that stands today, the risk is everywhere as it is. And so any chance that could reduce the risk somewhere, I guess maybe that would be a topic for further discussion and debate. Is that worth it if it then introduces those kind of disproportionate risks? That's really fascinating. Thank you for raising that.
Yeah, that was a great. It was an amalgamation of a couple questions. We have another person who is asking about like the wildlife in their backyard. That they have a lot of native trees and shrubs, and that their neighbors have cats who hunt in their yard, and if there's any leash laws that have passed in the United States that would give people who might be trying to encourage natives in their yards a fair shot at nurturing those species.
Yeah. I'm to the person who asked that, I'm sorry to hear that that situation is happening. That must be incredibly frustrating, and I'm sorry to hear that. There are municipalities that have leash laws in place. Something that unfortunately can happen when that goes into place is that then advocates of free roaming cats will fight to have a separate law put in place or have it written somewhere else in the code that cats are excluded. And so that's the case in DC. We have a leash law. You have to have your pet on a 6-foot leash unless it's a cat. So it doesn't, having the leash law, it's good for dogs, I suppose, but it negates the whole purpose, and it doesn't stop cats from the damage that they inflict or the damage that's inflicted on them. So if you choose to advocate for a leash law and you talk to your representatives about that, I think that's a fantastic approach. But I would make sure that you also then make it clear that cats needed to be included in the leash law because that's something that they kind of slip out of often.
Yeah, and one of our attendees was kind enough to do a little research, and she emailed me a list of cities that have a no cats at large policy. And so for the person who's asking and anyone else who's wondering, in the Twin Cities, it's Eagan, New Hope, Edina, Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, Woodbury, and then more broadly, Green Bay, Wisconsin, Fort Collins, Colorado, Tulsa, Oklahoma, Moorhead, and Duluth. And I don't have any policy details about how those laws were or ordinances were implemented or enforced, but you can do a little digging if you are so moved. So we have um, a lot of questions. We have a lot of questions. So um, one person was asking about reducing feral cats, and another person uh, was asking about like spaying and neutering and the impacts of spaying and neutering on like feral cat colonies. And then I also had a question about, along with that, the 2-year versus 10-year lifespan. And I was thinking about how if I, as a cat caregiver, knew that my cat was only going to live like an average of 2 years, that would upset me. But if it was like looking at it as an alternative to like euthanasia, like
Mhm.
how different policy advocates make those quality of life arguments. So I don't know if you could, and I have had worms actually. I was in the Peace Corps and I wouldn't want to live with it. So I do feel bad for all the cats that have to go with untreated tapeworm. But I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about like spay, neuter, reducing feral
Yeah.
cat populations, and then addressing the quality of life and lifespan versus um, like euthanasia, and particularly like a feral cat situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So trap, neuter, return is a common management strategy that attempts to reduce the population kind of on a long-term lens. And it does so by trapping cats, sterilizing them, and then putting them back where they were found. And so the idea there is that those cats are no longer sexually productive and they cannot then have offspring. And within a couple generations, then we'll see the population die out. This is often not effective. There have been a couple instances where it has worked. And those instances where it did work, like that's something to celebrate because by and large, this is a not successful program. The reason being, theoretically, it makes total sense and it should work. But the reason that it often is not successful is cats are really, really fertile. And so they will produce multiple litters a year. Kittens themselves are sexually active, and so they don't even have to wait for maturity to start popping out more kittens. So the population can grow really, really quickly. And you have to sterilize faster than they are reproducing to make an effect. Studies that have looked into it have found that numbers somewhere around 70 to 71% of adults have to be sterilized within the population every year. That is a huge effort. Assumably, maybe your city only has 10 cats, so maybe that's not a huge effort. But for most cities that have tons and tons of cats, in DC, we have the results of the cat count found that we have over 7,000 cats. So 70% of that every year is it's going to be a task. Oftentimes municipalities can't handle it. They just can't do it at that volume. Or the vets that are volunteering to try to help with this on the weekends, they're volunteering their time and they just don't have the capacity to do it either. And as a result, we often fall short and it doesn't actually control the population. Now, that being said, if you have a ton of spare resources laying around and you want to take what you consider to be the humane approach and go ahead and try to do this, that is fantastic. And if you can capture more than 70% a year, then maybe you will be able to decrease the population. What still needs to be considered, though, is even though you are avoiding euthanasia on the table as the option, you are still putting the cat back out there to potentially be hit by a car, to have tapeworm, to have ticks and fleas, to ingest poison. You're avoiding death per se, but you're also imposing or continuing the struggle for life that all too often results in suffering. And so we call it the humane solution, but when you consider the ramifications of it, it really makes you think is that really the humane approach? To kind of go into why those approaches are taken, there's just different philosophical approaches to evaluation of life and valuation of species between individuals who tend to be for outdoor cats and those who tend to be against. Those of us who tend to be against cats also tend to be wildlife people. Wildlife biologists think of animals in populations. So we think at the large level, think of all the animals in the system. People who tend to advocate for cats tend to think of it as a more individualistic issue. And so they aren't looking at all the prey that the cat are killing. They're not looking at any of the other ramifications. They're looking at just the cat. And so we have these two conflicting decisions, individualistic or population. And then we also have our valuation of life and welfare outcomes. And some people think that death is the worst outcome, and other people think that suffering is the worst outcome. People who tend to care for cats tend to think that death is the worst outcome. And so they're thinking about the individual, and they're trying to avoid death. And they will use those two approaches philosophically to justify actions that prolong or encourage suffering because it's avoiding death, and really focus on the individual because they're not thinking on the population or the holistic level. Something I want to specify is that this is well-intentioned often. Nobody on either side of this wakes up and says, I want to go hurt some animals today. I want to go put something in danger. Like, that's not something that happens. People who care for cats and put them outside are doing it because they think it's the best thing to do. And so we can't go in just yelling and screaming at them because they honestly believe that they're helping. And so it's a difficult, emotionally charged situation. And when you have those conflicting philosophies, oftentimes you can't see eye to eye and you have to meet in the middle somewhere.
Those are good thoughts. People are wondering how, like the policy example that you showed would be enforced. And then I'm also wondering if you have any examples of stricter policies in other municipalities or even other governments that have been enforced or approached differently, and what those outcomes have been, either in terms of creating more controversy or having a positive outcome on cats and wildlife. And if you've seen like lax, moderate, and extreme policies, and can just speak to those a little bit and how they work in practice with enforcement.
Yeah, enforcement's definitely a tough issue, right? Like, the officers are, they're limited in their resources and capacity as well. And it's an unrealistic expectation to think that any animal control officer is going to be able to really be prowling the streets for feral cats and taking care of that situation one by one. Cities that have enforced these types of regulations often use a reporting system. And so residents can call 311 or whatever your local number is and report that they're seeing a cat out, and then action is taken from there rather than the city going out and looking for them. But it can also be done in ways like, maybe the city sanctions trap, neuter, return in the cat inclusion areas, but they practice, they have the same trapping effort, but practice humane euthanasia in the exclusionary areas. Something like that, where there's just a difference of how the population is treated across that geographic boundary. But yes, most cities who do things like this tend to have a reporting system from residents in those geographic areas who can call and then have somebody sent out to handle the issue. Fines are also a way that it's been done. If you don't want to, none of your city council members are going to advocate that you put a policy in place where somebody comes and takes your neighbor's cat and kills it. That's a rough reality, and it wouldn't be great for your neighbor. Maybe they didn't hear about the policy, right? Like, that would be an awful situation. If they didn't hear about the policy change, they let their cat out and that was the end of it. So what some municipalities do instead is the cat gets returned if it's microchipped and the resident is fined, or the cat is held at the animal shelter. Regarding more strict policies, the one that comes to mind is the policies that have been put forth in Australia. If you are unfamiliar, just Google tonight after this talk, Australia feral cats, and you'll see not only how intensive their measures are to control the feral cat population, but how much controversy it has stoked, both within Australia as well as internationally. It has done great things, and they've been able to really cut down on the feral cat population. But socially, the cost has been, and financially, the cost has been very, very high. Australia is also in a really unique biological system where there are poisonous compounds that they can put out that don't affect their own native wildlife, but they do affect non-native wildlife. And so they're able to spray poison across the country that doesn't hurt the ecosystem, but only hurts invasive cats and foxes. And that's not something that we can really do anywhere else that's not such a unique community of animals. But still, from a policy perspective, I recommend looking to Australia for examples of really strict outdoor cat policy.
So we have a comment, and I'll turn it into a question. According to the CDC, cats are consistently the #1 carrier of rabies among domestic animals and disproportionately pose a risk of human exposure to rabies because of the increased likelihood of human-cat interactions. I guess the question is, isn't this risk of rabies enough to ban outdoor cats? And then I'll just pose the question. So like in the Everglades, we see like anaconda hunting bounties, and why couldn't a regulatory agency like the DNR just categorize them as an invasive species?
Mhm.
Would that be less or more controversial than municipalities trying to do it in their own way? And do you think that that the risk that rabies risk does merit banning outdoor cats?
I personally think the rabies risk and all the other risks that cats pose do warrant banning them. But as I showed on that slide, of cat owners' perceptions of it, they don't. And cat owners are pretty common in the country. Roughly half of Americans own a cat, and so there's a lot of people voting against those policies. It's an emotional issue for them, and when you have emotion, logic goes out the window, unfortunately. So I do think that logically, yes, that warrants banning it, but logic doesn't always prevail. The state taking over is an interesting question, and that does happen in some cases, but it is no less controversial. It has been on the floor for Virginia for several years now, and every year that Congress just kicks it to the next the next session because they get so many public comments and so many people from both sides are just really, really upset about it, and nobody really wants to take any serious action. I think all the science points to, yes, we should name these cats as invasive. We should open up a bounty on them. We should make it open season. But it can be politically difficult for some policymakers to do that. And so often at the state level, if it is required by the state Senate to write that in, it's probably not going to happen. If you can get it done through the DNR, your probability is probably higher. The last I checked, please check this yourself before you go off and act on this. But the last I checked, in the state of Minnesota, cats do not, or I think cats are listed as a pest species and are open season. But your own municipality probably will also have hunting regulations that would kind of impede on that. So some states are able to do it, but it's politically difficult.
Yes, I was being a little bit glib about like a hunting season on cats, but it is interesting when you think one of the questions was, why do you think cats are viewed differently than dogs? And I think another question is, why are cats viewed differently than other kinds of invasives and managed so differently? And so I don't know if you want to talk about people's adamance that cats don't need to be leashed, although they would probably acquiesce to a dog leash policy.
Yeah, it's not totally clear to me. I've never understood why people treat cats differently than dogs. You talk about cat people and dog people, and maybe there's just something different in how we respond to our pets if we tend to gravitate towards one species or the other. And then maybe that has certain personality traits. I'm not totally sure. Again, logically, it doesn't make any sense. We went through a big dog catcher phase in the US, and we got dogs off the street, and we saw a drop in rabies after that. It was a good thing to do. So it doesn't make any logical sense why we don't do the same with cats. And it can be frustrating. And similarly, as you said to the invasive species, there are many other invasive species that, like rats, we just want to get rid of them. Nobody wants to tolerate rats. But why are we tolerating cats? And in large part, it's because there's this emotional bond, and people feel a relationship with cats that they don't feel with other invasive species, and it contributes to the problem. And oftentimes people will say to me, yeah, we have these other invasive species. Why don't you worry about them first? It's like, well, nobody is raising rats in their garage on purpose and then tossing them on the street. Like, nobody's growing a flock of pigeons in their bedroom and then opening the window and letting them free. Like, that's unique to this particular invasive species, which means it's a problem that we could solve. It's within our capacity to solve it. But we just won't take those steps to do it, which is frustrating.
So I have another question about I don't know if you would be able to comment on this because it's specific to Minneapolis release of information. It was a data. I think I'll skip that question and maybe try to answer it offline. But I did have a question about the policy, the exclusionary zone, like compromise policy, and whether you see compromise policies as like a first step, like harm reduction. Is it harm reduction, or is it like a first step to sort of sensibilize people towards the idea of cats, keeping cats inside or away from the outdoors, and that like a city could adopt an exclusionary zone policy and then gradually move towards more restrictive policies as they get more data or better understand the issue and get resources for enforcement. I don't know if you can have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I definitely do. I think what you said is spot on. I think it's a great first step. I think it really, more than anything, I think it would bring groups together that normally wouldn't talk to each other, and able to sit in the same room. And once you see that a policy is put in place, it's not, it's not backfiring or whatever. It wasn't a situation to hoodwink you, and you start establishing trust between organizations, then maybe that policy can get stronger and stronger and stronger, and shift away from a narrative of you're trying to restrict my freedoms, you're trying to restrict my cat's freedoms, you're trying to take this away from me, can shift from that narrative to we're working together to protect all animals. And I think that's the approach that we ultimately need to get to. And yeah, this compromise, I'm hoping, is a good first step to get there.
That's really interesting. One of our volunteers is curious about your what additional research you have planned and what else you'd like to discover on this topic.
Yeah, I will be frank, I'm not always hoping to be studying cats. I would like to return to some other animals, but I will probably always have a couple cat projects going on for the rest of my career. But one that is coming up that I'm pretty excited about, I'm looking at how prey animals respond to light and noise pollution in relation to predator-prey interactions. So specifically, do prey animals show more fearful behavior in forests that are really noisy, like they're next to a highway? Do they show more fearful behavior because they can't hear a predator coming? Or do they take those areas as refuges because they're too noisy for predators? And so they view them as kind of like a safe spot away from predators. And of course, really prolific urban predator is the cat. And so I'll be looking at how these animals are kind of interacting with cats based on light and noise pollution. So introducing that new angle to it that's not purely cat, but I think will be insightful about urban ecosystem dynamics more broadly.
Well, that sounds really interesting, and also another topic that would be relevant to our chapter if you feel like coming back to present your findings.
Yeah, absolutely.
If there's any other questions, we have a few more minutes. Um, and, I can just ask, I'll just give people a chance to ask another question.
Sure.
Um, for the person who is asking about their neighbors' outdoor cats, I was wondering if you have any thoughts on um, interacting or educating people who might just have indoor outdoor cats that would, I have a cat that comes and poops in my garden where I'm growing food, and I don't like it, but I also, try to have neighborly relations with
Yeah.
other people in my community. And so I don't know if you've have any experience engaging with people or trying to educate them on the topic, or at least just keeping your own backyard safe from
Yeah.
cats. Someone was
Yeah.
asking about trapping and that sort of thing.
It can be really difficult and awkward, right? Like these are your neighbors, you're trying to have a good relationship. Um, I think before you try trapping or doing anything like that, I would have a conversation and just let them know. Uh, I I know somebody who, well, it's a friend of a friend, so I don't really know them personally, and wouldn't advocate you do this necessarily, but he shot a cat, a neighbor's cat that came into his yard, saying that it was killing the birds, and obviously the neighbor was quite distraught after that. And I think that maybe a conversation beforehand about, hey, please keep your cat inside, might have been a little bit more productive than that, and then they wouldn't have ruined their relationship with the neighbor. Um, so I think a relationship, if at all possible, is the first step. But trapping is an option. If other options aren't working for you, you can usually trap and take to the animal shelter. Sometimes they will just return it because it's your neighbor's property by law, and they deserve to have it returned. So it might not necessarily be fruitful, but if nothing else, it might send a message that you really don't like it. And maybe that will be enough to get them to act. There are, if you call the animal shelter about this, they'll tell you about humane deterrents, things um, like, I don't even know what it's for, like that plastic spike strip that, thinking like the plastic you put on the carpet so you can have your rolly chair. If you turn that upside down, it's got little spikes on it. And if you put that out on your yard, cats don't like how that feels on their paws. And so that is one way to deter them. Um, Spraying with a hose, if it comes at a certain time every day and you can catch it and spray it a couple times of that, might be enough to enforce a behavior change. Um, it's really contextual. It varies by situation. But if you let your neighbor know how much it's bothering you, hopefully that will be enough and you won't have to go to the other measures.
That's a great answer. I just wanted to be clear that our chapter doesn't endorse shooting cats or harming them. We do advocate for conversations and educating your neighbor, um, using have a heart traps where warranted and safe. And so I just wanted to put that out there that we wouldn't want anyone's pet cat to be hurt in a dispute. Um,
And I'll mimic that or mirror that. I also am not advocating for that to happen. So
this is
please
what I
don't write me an email saying that that's not what should happen, because I agree. I don't think that should be the route that we go.
Yeah. Um, and someone's curious about the pictures from the cat study and whether you use them for any other research purposes that weren't necessarily cat related.
That's a great question. We did do a couple studies that were just looking at wildlife behavior broadly, and we have a couple more coming up. But because the project was funded by PetSmart charities, they were really paying us for cat research more than anything else. And so that's where the bulk of our focus had to go. Anything else we did was a side project that we had to do outside of work hours. And so there's only so much motivation for that. But we do have a couple more on the way that we're trying to look at shifts in wildlife behavior based on human activity, kind of gradients of where animals occur across the city, landscape connectivity, things of that nature. And I'll say, if anybody here is a student or a researcher, or you have a question that you think that data set could help you with, it is publicly available on the Smithsonian's repository. You can find that at emammal.com.
This is a question. I haven't heard of a bird be safe collar, but one of our viewers is wondering if they actually work, because they're bright colors and birds and reptiles can see in color, unlike mice. And so would they be effective to reduce predation?
That's a great question. The results are mixed. In large part, they don't help. There are some instances where they can help, but the effect is not generally huge. There are also, this particular study I'm thinking of used the Bird Be Safe brand, but they used a couple other brands too, and we're seeing how it compared. And some collars actually increased the birds or the cats' predation rate. So obviously an outcome that was very counter to what the owner was trying to get at by putting the collar on the cat. So that said, there are steps that you can take to try to reduce the efficacy of the cat's predation. They don't always work. Even if they did work 100% of the time, though, recall those sublethal effects where even just the presence of the cat is enough to kill off some bird species because they'll abandon the nest or they'll stop feeding their young. So even if a collar does keep the cat from physically killing the bird, that doesn't mean that it has stopped the environmental damage from happening.
And then don't forget about the baby bunnies and squirrels.
And yes.
And actually, another point is that in the springtime, there are some birds who fledge before their tail feathers grow in completely. So like robins and I believe cardinals, and they actually spend a week on the ground and they're flightless, and their parents will come down and feed them. And so, and then after a few days or a week, their tail feathers will grow in and they'll be able to fly. And but for that week that they're on the ground, they are very vulnerable. And so I think in that situation, being able to see the cat wouldn't necessarily protect them or empower them to flee, because it's just a vulnerable time in their development stage.
That's a great point.
And then I would also just say a safe alternative I do know of is catios, and I think they're gaining in popularity, and they're just a lot of fun. There's so many designs and different ways they can be simple or elaborate, and so I would advocate that. My sister's a cat person, and she has a cool catio. And so I think that's a nice way to let your cat enjoy the outdoors safely.
Yeah, catios can be really, really cool. And just like if you're a creative person and you're a handy person, you can do such cool things with them and really give your cat just an amazing experience and really stimulate its welfare.
Yeah, and there is this late spring or summer a chicken coop and catio tour that goes on in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And so if you know anyone who's curious, you can find that online. I believe Urban Eggplant, the Urban Farm Supply Store, was a co-sponsor of the event with a cat rescue. And so I think it would be a lot of fun to take a little tour of all the chicken coops and catios in the cities and get some inspiration. So I think we've gotten a lot of feedback that people enjoyed. This was an excellent talk and conversation. And another person who gave feedback that the city has said that people shouldn't engage with their neighbors regarding their cat outdoors. I'd be curious to know which city official voiced that viewpoint. And I just wanted to thank Dan and all of our listeners for coming tonight. We have recorded this program. And so we will make it available on our YouTube channel if you're interested in sharing it with others or know someone who wasn't able to attend. And we will welcome you to check out our upcoming program in March, which is Planting for Climate Resilience with the owner of Shelterwood Gardens. And I will just post I can't post in the chat, but you can send us feedback to our email address, admin@minneapolisaudubon.org, or follow us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, or our website, minneapolisaudubon.org. And we're so glad that you joined us tonight and hope to see you again. And again, a big round of applause to our awesome presenter and interesting research, Dan. So thank you so much, and good night, everyone.